Hello, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you today to Susan G. Komen's virtual MBC Impact Series event for December. My name is Casey Volpe, and I am manager of MBC initiatives here at Komen. The programming for the series is envisioned as a year-long conversation with attendees where we cover new information and speakers each month. Today, our topic is exercise and lifestyle interventions to reduce symptoms and improve quality of life. We have a fantastic speaker, Dr. Jennifer Ligabell, and a lovely moderator, Lexi Budrag, who I'll introduce in just a moment. Before we begin, I have to thank our sponsors for the 2024 MBC Impact Series events. It is almost 2025, guys. So our premier sponsors, thank you to AZ, AstraZeneca, Gilead, GE Healthcare, and Merck, and also Walgreens and Daiichi Sankyo. One more housekeeping note. While our speakers are talking, please feel free to post your questions in the Q&A feature in Zoom. You'll see that right at the bottom of your screen. And we'll get through as many questions as we can. Please remember that our speakers are not able to provide individual or specific medical advice, but rather are here speaking to their own experiences. So keep your questions as general as possible.
Hello, everyone. It looks like Casey ran into some technical difficulties. So once she gets back on board, we will have her finish the lovely introduction that she had ready. But for now, I'm going to pass the mic over to our moderator for today, Lexi. If you want to go ahead and introduce yourself. Lexi lives in the suburbs of Phoenix, Arizona with her husband, Nick, and together they have two grown daughters, Christy and Carla. Lexi has 40 years of experience as a paralegal and director in real estate management and development. She and her husband are 20-year franchisees of Rocky Mountain Chocolate Factory. So super jealous of that. I love that store. They own and operate the store located in Uptown Sedona, Arizona. Lexi is also a member of the Franchise Advisory Council for Rocky Mountain Chocolate Factory, Inc. Lexi was diagnosed with de novo metastatic breast cancer in 2022, and shortly after finishing chemotherapy, she experienced pathological fractures in her pelvis due to the cancer treatments weakening her bones. These fractures made it nearly impossible to walk without the use of walking aids. At the direction of her incredible medical team, she began a fitness regimen, incorporated changes to lifestyle, and worked hard on becoming physically fit. She managed to recover from the fractures, is now active and thriving. Lexi is passionate about helping the MBC community or patient community sort through the emotions, fear, and chaos that ensues when diagnosed with metastatic breast cancer. She aims to inspire hope and help others find the key to unlocking their own best quality of life. In conjunction with the treatments and therapies available today and those on the horizon, Lexi believes that with great determination, it is possible to thrive with MBC. So Lexi, thank you so much for being here. I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you. Personally, I find this topic fascinating. When I was diagnosed de novo in 2022, I was out of shape, overweight, and generally ill-prepared for the fight of my life. While my oncology team supported me through the initial treatment of chemo, diet, and fitness was not highlighted. After finishing chemo, I focused on improving my physical being in order to become healthy and fit so I could better cope with side effects of a lifetime of treatments. Without further delay, I'd like to introduce Dr. Ligabel, who is an associate professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School and senior physician at the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute. She is also the director of the Leonard P. Zakim Center for Integrative Therapies and Healthy Living and the director of the Center for Faculty Wellbeing at Dana-Farber. Dr. Ligabel's research interests focus on the impact of lifestyle factors, such as physical activity and body weight, on breast cancer risk and outcomes. She has conducted more than a dozen lifestyle intervention trials in cancer populations, evaluating the impact of exercise and weight loss interventions on endpoints such as biomarkers associated with cancer risk and outcomes, fitness, body composition, and quality of life in cancer patients and survivors. Dr. Ligabel's work has also focused on exploring the biological basis for the relationship between energy balance and cancer through interventional projects in cancer and at-risk populations, evaluating the biological changes that occur with weight loss and increased physical activity. Her prior work has established the impact of exercise on immune and inflammatory biomarkers in breast cancer, providing some of the first evidence that exercise could have a direct impact on breast cancer. Dr. Ligabel's Komen-funded research is focused on understanding the impact of a weight loss intervention on the risk of disease recurrence in women with early-stage breast cancer and obesity as part of a randomized phase 3 trial entitled the Breast Cancer Weight Loss Study, known as B-Well. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Ligabel.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. Thank you to Komen for inviting me here today and for really all the support over the years of this research. So I'm going to share my screen and share some slides to kind of guide us through, and then happy to answer any questions that people may have at the end of this presentation, because I know that diet and exercise are definitely things that we hear a lot about. And there is definitely information out there that's helpful, and there's information out there that sometimes isn't so helpful. And I think that this is a bit of an understatement to hear that people with breast cancer get a lot of advice about what they should be eating, about what they should be doing. And sometimes it's pretty contradictory. You can see two newspaper articles side by side. One of them says, coffee associated with lower risk of this, that, and the other. And then the other headline saying, don't drink coffee, or, 6 foods to avoid. I think that there's just an awful lot out there in the lay press. And so what our goal is today is to spend a little bit of time thinking about, well, what's the real evidence? What's the connection between diet and exercise and breast cancer? And then delve a little bit more deeply into a topic that hasn't been studied as much, which is, are these things still important after someone develops metastatic breast cancer? Can diet and exercise make a difference in that setting? So we're going to start with kind of a higher level topic is, diet and exercise. Is this really something that has a direct relevance to breast cancer? And I think that at this point, there has been now several decades of research that's been done looking at these connections To understand this fully, I want to take a step back and think about this balance that we all have in our bodies between the calories that we consume in food, the energy that we expend. And we think a lot about exercise as kind of a part of that. There's also metabolism, and both of these things kind of burn calories. So you've got the food that you eat, the spending of those calories through exercise and metabolism, and then what results is weight. And all of these factors, diet, exercise, and weight, and particularly obesity, have all been linked to breast cancer. And in fact, there are now hundreds and hundreds of trials that study connections between these things and cancer. I'm going to talk a little bit about some work that's been done to bring this all together, because I think one of the things that's important to recognize is that because there are so many studies looking at these factors in breast cancer, that you can always find one study that's going to show something that may be a little bit different than the others and those are often the things that get the headlines. So when we think about, well, what are the true connections? We don't just think about one study, but we try to put this all together and look at things like reviews and meta-analyses. And these are places where scientists have kind of brought together all of the information and tried to synthesize it and look for patterns, like where is there some consistency? So a group called the American Society for Clinical Oncology, some of you may have heard of this. It's sort of the biggest oncology group actually in the world. And they do a lot of work focused both on patients, but also on oncologists and other people working in the oncology space to try to help figure out, well, what really should be the guidelines that we give to patients and that we give to oncologists when they're treating patients to make sure that people get good quality care. And so we tried to put together a guideline through ASCO to provide guidance about diet, exercise, and weight for patients receiving cancer treatment. So this wasn't focused on everybody with cancer, but it was really trying to look at, while you're receiving therapy, are there important things that you should be doing? So what we did was we reviewed all of the evidence from randomized trials. So these were studies where people were actually assigned to an exercise program or not assigned to an exercise program or a diet change or weight loss, to try to understand how those things, if you are a patient, you're starting chemotherapy and you want to figure out, what can I do to help myself? These studies all looked at people making a change in something, exercising more, starting to lift weights, changing their diet, cutting their calories, or shifting from carbohydrates to fat or fat to carbohydrates, or fasting, losing weight. All of these studies looked at kind of doing something differently. And the goal here was to see, is there evidence that those things make a difference in cancer outcomes? Things like recurrence and survival, but also things like the side effects of cancer treatment, how people feel, whether they were able to finish all their treatment or not. So the goal of this guideline was to try to put all this together and see if we could come up with some clear guidance for things that people should be doing, a prescription for lifestyle during their cancer treatment. And so what we found, first of all, was that there was a fair amount of evidence. We found 52 what they call systematic reviews, which are papers that summarize data from dozens of clinical trials and 23 additional trials. When we looked at this more closely, we found that most of this evidence really focused on the value of exercise. And there were actually hundreds of different studies that looked at different exercise programs, different settings, many fewer studies of diet change, and actually only a handful of studies that looked at weight loss or preventing weight gain. The other thing that we saw when we were looking across all this evidence was that a lot of it was collected in breast cancer patients. So this is kind of good as we think about, well, how do we create a prescription for lifestyle for people with breast cancer? There's actually a fair amount of evidence that's been gathered in patients with breast cancer, but almost none of it focused on patients living with advanced disease. Almost all of this research was done in patients with early stage cancers. So I'm going to spend a couple of minutes on it because I do think it's important to understand the kind of evidence that's out there. But think we have to recognize that big guidelines like this, unfortunately, don't provide as much helpful information for people living with advanced disease as they do for a patient undergoing chemotherapy for early cancer or taking anti-estrogen treatment after their surgery. So those are the patients that are more incorporated into these guidelines. So with that caveat, what did we learn from this big effort to bring together all this evidence? So many studies, as I said before, looking at exercise programs. They looked at all kinds of exercise programs, aerobic exercise, weightlifting. They found that exercise broadly has a number of benefits for patients receiving treatment. It reduces fatigue, improves quality of life, prevents decline in fitness and strength, which often happen over the course of treatment, and also helped with mood. People were less anxious and less depressed when they were exercising regularly. So because of all this evidence, the ASCO group decided that the number one finding from this big effort would be that we should be recommending exercise as a part of treatment for patients with early breast cancer. Again, not enough evidence at the time we developed this guideline a few years ago to include patients with advanced disease, but we're going to talk in a few minutes about some work that's happened since this guideline was published to try to expand this recommendation a bit more broadly. But kind of as a high-level recommendation, a lot of evidence that exercise is good to help people feel better during treatment. Well, what about cancer recurrence and cancer mortality and those types of things? Unfortunately, not enough evidence from these kinds of randomized trials to be able to say yes or no whether exercise actually not only helps people feel better, but actually helps them do better from a cancer perspective. So that's kind of another unanswered question. So what about diet? We talked about the fact a lot less evidence about diet than exercise. We found that the diet literature was also a lot harder to kind of put together into concrete recommendations. Unlike exercise, where, doing any amount of exercise is good, it probably doesn't make a huge difference what kind you pick. These studies really looked at all different kinds of diets. They looked at low carbohydrate diets, they looked at low fat diets, they looked at fasting, they looked at ketogenic diets. So really hard to kind of develop any kind of consistent recommendation from those things. I think the one thing that we were able to kind of pull out was that the evidence did not show that these kind of so-called neutropenic diets, where you don't eat fresh fruits and vegetables, that you only eat things that are cooked, that these diets that avoided fresh fruits and vegetables actually did not have any benefit from people. So the one thing we were able to say about diet was it is fine to eat fruits and vegetables when you're getting treatment, just wash them. Vegetables don't all have to be cooked. I think in emphasizing the importance of the nutrients you get from these fresh fruits and vegetables, we do recommend that people eat them no matter what kind of treatment they're getting. But we were not able to kind of develop other more specific guidance. There was no clear evidence that reducing fat or carbohydrates or following a ketogenic diet or fasting was beneficial during treatment. So it doesn't say that those things are harmful, but there just wasn't enough evidence to say that they were beneficial. And this was also very similar for weight loss. Really little information about the value of losing weight during your cancer treatment. And, we recognize that a lot of women with breast cancer actually gain some weight as a result of their treatment. So this has been a lot of very interesting to people. Now, the number one thing I get asked these days when I talk about weight loss is about GLP-1 receptor agonists, the weight loss drugs. There is really no evidence at this point about their safety in patients living with advanced disease or really even earlier disease getting chemotherapy. So more to come on that for sure. But this large review showed that even in patients with early stage cancers, not a lot of evidence to prove or disprove whether weight loss has benefits. So a lot of work done. What we really came away with was exercise is beneficial for people. We don't know as much about some of these other elements of lifestyle. So I'm going to transition now to think about, well, not enough evidence to be included in these big guidelines, but what do we know about diet and exercise in patients living with metastatic breast cancer? The first thing that we looked at as a group was, well, how much exercise are women doing? And this was a study that primarily enrolled women, but recognizing that men with breast cancer also experience weight gain and may benefit from some of these types of lifestyle interventions. So this was a study that looked at patients undergoing treatment for metastatic breast cancer, and they were starting first-line chemotherapy. So they either had hormone receptor positive cancers and had already been treated with anti-estrogen treatments and were moving on to chemotherapy, or they had triple negative cancers. So this was information that was collected in the setting of a big study testing different kinds of chemotherapy. So we asked patients when they were starting the study how much exercise they were doing and what type of exercise. And we found that almost half of patients weren't really doing any exercise at all, less than an hour of exercise a week. Another 20-ish% were exercising between 1 and 3 hours a week. And about a third of patients met guidelines, which include about 3 hours of exercise a week. We did find in this study that the people who were exercising were more likely to be a little bit younger, they tended to be a bit leaner, and they had higher levels of physical function. And whether that was because of the exercise or they were more able to exercise because they were more functional, you can't really tease apart in this kind of study where we just gave people questionnaires and we had them fill them out. So that's why it's important that there are other kinds of studies as well that actually change people's behavior. And I'm going to spend a couple of minutes talking about a large trial that was run by a colleague of mine, Dr. Anna May in Sweden. This is the biggest exercise trial that's ever been conducted in patients who are living with metastatic breast cancer. The study actually enrolled patients from a bunch of different countries, so 8 centers in 5 EU countries, as well as Australia. And what the study did was that it enrolled women who weren't exercising very much, who had advanced breast cancer, and randomly assigned them to an exercise intervention or to a no exercise group. They were not told they couldn't exercise, but they weren't given a specific program. So these 350 patients were randomly assigned to these 2 groups. To take part, you had to be at least 18, you had to have stage 4 breast cancer, you had to be able to move around. So that ECOG performance status kind of says if your status is 2 or less, that means you're spending most of your time in bed, and that is would be pretty difficult with an exercise program. Other exclusion criteria, you couldn't have an area in your bone with a metastasis that was looking like it might break, and you couldn't already be doing a lot of exercise. So what was the exercise program that people were doing? This, you can see here a little bit of a schematic. This was a 9-month program. And one of the important things was this was a program that people did with a trainer who was trained in working with patients with cancer. And so again, this program took place in Europe primarily. They have a little bit of a different healthcare system there with coverage of things that are not quite covered here. So all of these patients went into a hospital or a physical therapy group, and they worked twice a week with a trainer if they were assigned to the exercise group. If they were assigned to the control group, they got a Fitbit or another activity monitoring device, and they got recommendations for exercise, but they didn't get the program. And this is exactly here what the program involves. So they did both aerobic training, so things like on a bike or a treadmill, both moderate and intense activity. And then they did resistance training with bands and weights to kind of build muscle strength. And then the last thing that they did was some balance training to really make sure that people were stable on their feet. The patients worked with a trainer twice a week during the first 6 months of the study. And then in the last piece, which was the other 3 months, they worked with the trainer once a week and then did an unsupervised session once a week. Here were the patients, and again, this is a big study, around 350 patients, because there were a couple of men. Here you can see average age was between 55 and 56. Again, I think there was one man in each group. Patients were largely had gone to college for at least some period of time. The majority were living together or married. Their average body mass index was at the top end of the overweight range at the beginning. You can see that about a third of patients had metastatic breast cancer as their first cancer, and the other 2/3 had had cancer, had other treatments, and then the cancer came back. Most of the patients were taking part in this study shortly after being diagnosed with breast cancer, so in the first or second line of treatments. You can see that most patients had metastases in their bones, and more than 50% were being treated with anti-estrogen treatments, either by themselves or combined with another targeted medicine. So did this program have benefits? What the investigators found was that patients who were assigned to the exercise group had better quality of life and less fatigue at 3 months, 6 months, and 9 months compared to patients in the control group. So showing that the exercise helped people feel better, reduce their fatigue, and gave them a better quality of life. The other big question for this study was this really achievable for patients? Were they able to do this level of exercise? And the investigators found that more than 3/4 of patients completed more than 3/4 of the exercise sessions, and less than 20% of patients dropped out before the 6-month mark. So really showing that this was something that people could do and found some value from. Now, there were 2 adverse events. There were 2 bone breaks, neither one of them in an area of bone metastases, but one patient broke her wrist and one patient broke her pelvis. The study also demonstrated that patients had other significant benefits. They were more functional, they had better quality of life, but they did have a little bit more shortness of breath and a little bit more pain if they were assigned to the exercise group. So this is kind of the largest exercise study in patients with metastatic breast cancer. And I think putting all this together, we do see that there's a lot of patients who aren't regularly exercising after being diagnosed with metastatic breast cancer. This big study from Dr. May showed that this exercise program, which was staffed by professional trainers, led to benefits in quality of life, fatigue, and other side effects. But I think taking a step back from this, we see some value of exercise, but also recognize that not everybody has access to a trainer like that. And I think one of the things that really is important as a next step here is trying to figure out how do we bring exercise like this to all of the women and men with metastatic breast cancer who might benefit from this. So still more work to be done here, but really promising data at this point about the benefits of exercise in patients living with advanced breast cancer. I guess the only other thing I wanted to say is that these studies also demonstrated that exercise was safe for patients with metastatic breast cancer, but it's always important to ask your oncology team before starting an exercise program to make sure that it's safe for you. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit now and talk about diet. And I want to say that there is no big study like the trial that we just talked about looking at dietary change in patients with breast cancer. Unfortunately, kind of like is true for early breast cancer, there is very little research looking at the benefits of different diets in patients with metastatic breast cancer. We have a lot of evidence from animals, and this is oftentimes when you see a headline in the paper or in a magazine, many of the findings that kind of drive those articles come from studies in test tubes and in animals. And I'm going to give you the example here of broccoli and breast cancer. I'm imagining that most of you have seen headlines like these: worried about breast cancer, eat your broccoli, foods for breast cancer prevention, broccoli and cancer prevention is not a myth. So, what's underlying all of these headlines? And, the first thing that people often turn to is sort of evidence in test tubes. And in fact, there have been a number of studies that have shown that if you grow breast cancer cells in a lab and you mix them with high concentrations of nutrients from broccoli, the growth rate of the breast cancer cells slows and cells have a higher death rate. Now, it's tricky to know how to interpret this kind of evidence because if you put enough of something on anything, it's going to die. And can your normal cells tolerate the levels of broccoli that you're exposing these breast cancer cells to? And there's not a great answer from that. But this type of research often leads to the next step, which is experiments in mice and rats. Mice and rats are a little closer to people than test tubes are, but still some pretty significant differences. And here's an example of a study in rats where they took female rats, they divided them into groups. Some were given 5 days of nutrients isolated from broccoli, and some were given typical food with no broccoli. And then all the rats were exposed to a chemical that causes breast cancer. And what they found in this experiment was that rats given high doses of broccoli nutrients were about 50% less likely to develop breast cancer, which is impressive. I think, again, what we don't know is this wasn't on the right here, these little mice nibbling on broccoli. These were animals that were given a broccoli isolate, really high dosage. Is this something that is really reproducible in people? So what do we know about broccoli in people? There have been no randomized studies where people have been given broccoli or broccoli nutrients, so we don't really know what would happen if you gave women the equivalent dose of broccoli as was shown to be beneficial in those rats. But there have been studies that have asked people, do you eat broccoli? How much broccoli do you eat? What else do you eat if you're not eating broccoli? So these studies have then followed people over time to see, do people who really love broccoli have a lower risk of breast cancer? And so far, the results from this kind of study have been really inconsistent. Some have shown a link between more broccoli intake and lower breast cancer risk, but others have shown no difference. And I think that the reality is that there aren't a lot of trials and there's not a lot of appetite, no pun intended, to be doing very, very large studies where we're randomizing people to take broccoli or not. We already know there's a value of a healthy diet more broadly. So I think we're left with sort of this big question mark about what should we tell people to eat. And in the lack of having much more concrete information in people, we kind of fall back to a more healthy dietary plan that's been shown to have other health benefits like cardiovascular disease and diabetes. And we tell people fruits and vegetables are good, try to avoid fatty foods, processed foods, sugary foods. But we don't have a ton of specific evidence that this is important for cancer prevention and control as opposed to just a more healthy life. So again, more we need to learn about diet and breast cancer. So I'm going to finally turn to weight and metastatic breast cancer. And I will say that as little that we know about diet, we know even less about weight loss and weight loss programs, whether they be lifestyle-based or drug-based, and outcomes in patients with metastatic breast cancer. We do know that obesity is a risk factor for developing breast cancer. It's a risk factor for developing breast cancer recurrence, but there's really been nothing that's looked at whether body mass index or excess weight or any of those types of factors are linked to outcomes after breast cancer becomes metastatic, either in terms of whether the cancer spreads more quickly or where it spreads. So they're really, so far from the evidence that we do have suggests that this may not be as critical of a factor in the setting of advanced cancer as it may be in earlier cancer and in preventing cancer in the first place. So I'm going to sum this up. We've kind of gone through a lot of different areas. I do think that the one thing that we can say for sure, based on the evidence that's been done before, is that exercise has a lot of benefits for patients in patients with cancer more broadly, patients with breast cancer, and patients with advanced breast cancer. We have pretty limited research looking at dietary change and weight loss in patients with metastatic breast cancer. And this really doesn't provide us with the evidence that we would need to tell people what foods they should eat or not eat. I think so far we don't have strong links between weight and treatment effectiveness in metastatic breast cancer, but there's only been a couple of studies that have evaluated this, so more to learn there. Before we turn things over to questions, I did want to just point to some resources for exercise. I think eventually our hope is that there's going to be better infrastructure and potentially some third-party support, like an insurance company paying for an exercise program for patients with metastatic breast cancer. But for now, there are community-based programs, things like the Live Strong at the YMCA. And there's also a lot of online resources now. We have many virtual exercise classes through our Zakim Center at Dana-Farber, and many cancer institutes now provide exercise programming for their patients. And if that is available in your area, I really encourage you all to check that out. So I think now we are ready to transition over to the part of the program where we answer some questions. Looks like we have a few already. I think, Lexi, you are going to moderate this part.
Yes. Thank you for that presentation. The first question that we have is, a lot of time is spent focusing on treatment during appointments. How do you suggest patients bring up quality of life issues with their doctor?
So I think that's a great question. And there have been some surveys that we did through ASCO, evaluating from the patient perspective and from the provider perspective, like, do oncology providers talk about lifestyle during cancer treatment? And if they do, when do those conversations occur? And what we found was that the conversations occur a lot more frequently in the setting of early stage disease versus later stage disease. And that people talk about exercise more than they do diet and more than they do weight. But even in the best of circumstances, only about 50% of patients recalled ever hearing their oncologist talk about something related to diet, exercise, or their weight. And so this is one of the reasons why we've done a lot of work through ASCO, really trying to bring more awareness of the importance of these factors. But for the patient side, I think that it can be a little intimidating at times to bring something up if your oncologist isn't mentioning it. More and more places have the ability to kind of write things down before the appointment, fill out like a questionnaire or a quality of life, and that's kind of a place where you could potentially kind of write that down. But I think many oncologists also at the end of the appointment will ask, do you have any questions? And that can be a little intimidating, but I think it's important to be a good advocate for yourself and to be able to ask those questions. And I think from a researcher standpoint, our goal is to keep generating more and more evidence that these things are important, to give the oncologist something to talk about. Because I think that's the other piece, is that oncology providers are less likely to bring something up if they don't have anything to say. So if they're not sure what the answer is, they're less likely to bring up the question.
Thank you. Our second question is, why do you focus on exercise and lifestyle in your research? What's behind your decision to focus your research in this area?
That's a great question. I have been an oncologist now for a really long time. And when I first started working in this field, my patients would always ask me at the end of many times months of chemotherapy, radiation, surgery, Dr. Ligabell, what can I do to help myself? And there wasn't a whole lot of answer to that question. Take your tamoxifen regularly. We had just have these brand new drugs called aromatase inhibitors back then. But there really wasn't much else that we could tell people that this is something that you can do. And that's actually then, as research started growing that things that we didn't expect to be related to breast cancer seem to be related to better outcomes, like people with lower levels of insulin, people who exercised more from observational studies. So I really wanted to understand, how could those types of factors help people? Like, why would it make sense biologically that exercise or losing weight could have an impact on breast cancer? And then how do you get people to do it? So those were the kind of driving factors that really led me to start studying this now almost 20 years ago, which is sort of crazy to think.
Our next question is, what is the chemical that is used in rats that cause breast cancer?
So I will say I am not a basic scientist, and so I don't want to misspeak. There are many, these are not chemicals that you're going to come across in the environment. So these are special mice that have predisposition to developing cancer when exposed to different compounds. And so I can't answer that exactly, but there are specific mouse systems that are developed to have a sensitivity and develop cancer when exposed to particular chemicals. But again, this is not something that you need to think about, oh no, could I accidentally be drinking this kind of what? It is not that. You would have to have like a sensitivity or susceptibility that was genetically programmed, and people do not have those types of susceptibilities.
Okay. You've been involved in a lot of research. In your opinion, what was the most significant research finding that has had the most impact on your patients' quality of life?
So I think the things that have had the most impact on quality of life has been the many, many studies that show the value of exercise. It was when I first started working in this area, we would tell people that they should rest during chemotherapy and during their treatment and not to exert themselves. We told people who had lymph node surgery, had lymph nodes removed as part of their surgery, that they should never lift anything with their arm again. And as we've done research, we found that in fact the opposite is true. If you stay active through your treatment, you will have much less fatigue. Like if you stay on the couch for 3 to 6 months, you lose a ton of muscle, and that has long-term repercussions for people. And if you do structured strength training with your arm instead of not using it ever, you're at much lower risk of developing lymphedema. So for me, I think the thing that I have found is the value of exercise in improving quality of life in so many different dimensions.
Great. From the audience, thank you for doing this. Is there any research on whether exercise can extend your life when you have metastatic breast cancer?
So there is not at this point, and there are a couple of studies going on that are going to try to look at that. Although right now there's nothing that is large enough to have the kind of power of a drug study. Like you would need a study of probably 500 or 600 people. And so far the studies have been smaller than that. So we don't have that information at this point. We do know that people that have higher levels of physical function, higher levels of fitness seem to do better, but that sometimes is a little bit of a chicken and an egg phenomenon. So it's something that really needs to be studied, but we don't have the data yet.
Okay. Well, Dr. Ligabell, thank you so much for answering these questions. At this time, I'm going to turn it back to Casey.
Great.
So not Casey. Casey is having technical difficulties once again, so I will close us out. But first want to thank Lexi for her excellent moderating and Dr. Ligabell for sharing such wonderful information with our audience today. Thank you so much for that. Let me just make sure I have everything right. Hang on one second. All right, so today's session was recorded and will be posted on our landing page very soon. That's komen.org/NBC series, where you can find all of our past episodes as well as our YouTube page. So you can rewatch this session or any of our previous sessions you may have missed. Please help us spread the word about this important content with your friends, family, and healthcare professionals. And once again, we want to acknowledge our sponsors of the 2024 NBC Impact Series. Their generous support allows us to continue to bring this community together to share important information, resources, and experiences. So thank you to our premier sponsors, GE Healthcare, AstraZeneca, Merck, and Gilead, and our signature sponsors, Walgreens and Daiichi Sankyo. This series was made possible because of their generosity. Please also help us by completing a survey, which you can find in the chat feature there. Your feedback is very important and helpful to us for future NBC programming. Finally, the next event in the NBC Impact Series will be in will be in January, and is focusing on new treatments and approaches to ER-positive metastatic breast cancer. So thank you once again to our speakers, our moderator, our generous sponsors, and to all of you for joining us today. We wish you all a happy holiday, and we will see you next time.